Nuestra universidad tiene una larga tradición de estudios sobre desarrollo y una larga presencia desde hace varias décadas en algunos países asiáticos y latinoamericanos. Hemos trabajado especialmente en Centroamérica, que es una región con problemas específicos estos días, ¿verdad? Nuestra relación con universidades de todo el mundo es determinante para definir nuestra identidad y nuestra pertenencia a la red de universidades jesuitas también, y nos ayuda a priorizar el desarrollo y la desigualdad en nuestra agenda de investigación. Our relationships, I move to English again, our relationship with universities all over the world is determined to define who we are, and the network of Jesuit universities also help us to prioritize development and inequality in our research agenda. Let me ask Carlos Losada to say a few words of welcome at the beginning of this seminar. Carlos Losada is the delegado en español, of the network of Jesuit universities in Spain. Voy a dar la palabra a Carlos Losada, que es el director, el delegado de UNIGES, la Asociación de Universidades Jesuitas Españolas, para que nos dé algunas palabras de aliento y bienvenida. Te agradecemos mucho tu presencia hoy con nosotros, Carlos.
Muchas gracias, Pedro. Creo que me oís bien, ¿no? Pues, first of all, let me start giving you the good morning for some of you, good afternoon for most of us, and perhaps good evening and good night for some of our colleagues from other regions of the world. As Pedro already said, my name is Carlos Losada. I am chairing UNIGES, that, as he told you, is a federation of Jesuit universities here in Spain. La Loyola, the university hosting this event, is part of this network, of this federation. What I would like to do is to address a very short words of welcoming. The first message is just to underline our commitment as universities linked with the Jesuits with this theme, with this issue that is for us is a key question, strongly related with our mission, with our nature, with, let me say, our ontology of our institutions. The second issue is that we consider these matters really a global issue. We need to focus to approach them from a very holistic way. Just to finish my short introduction, just to underline again that we approach this very important problem from a very holistic point of view, and that we are committed beyond this seminar, beyond the La Loyola Andalucía, to try to go deeper in these kind of reflections. In fact, what I would like to finish is encouraging you precisely to go deeper in this reflection, and to try, if you can, to try to offer us good knowledge from academic point of view, but also knowledge that can orient our action.
We move to the second part. Chema, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro, and we will do this in English as expected. Although Arjun Atilla's Spanish, I'm sure is really good, but we will move into English. Thanks a lot, Claudia, Nora, for your brilliant insights. They show how central is good research and policy outreach and policy influence, public outreach and public and policy influence in tackling inequalities. So let's go to this second session. It's my pleasure to moderate it and to introduce the two panelists we have in this one. It's really long to go through all the past experience that they accumulate. So trying to summarize a bit, we will have Atilla Waris, She's the only professor of fiscal law and policy in Eastern and Central Africa, what is a lot to say. And she is currently the first female deputy principal of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the first female director of research and enterprise at the University of Nairobi. So thanks a lot, Atiye, for joining us this afternoon, evening, morning. And then we will have Arjun Fayadev. He's a professor of economics and the director at the School of Arts and Sciences at the Asim Premji University of Bangalore, India. Let me say that we are all with everyone facing COVID across the world, but I think that very specifically now with India at these very tough times that you're going through. Coming back to you, he's a senior economist at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and has also worked as associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks both. And we keep the same guiding questions with different backgrounds and approaches as we had for session one. So from your background and current work, what are the main areas of work you are now working on to face the inequality crisis, and what are the drivers of that underpin your work, and also the more general one of what you think are the roles and the priorities for the university, for academy, for research centers that they should emphasize to contribute to this fight. How can we be more influential in the debate and policy change around growing inequality? We will begin with Atiye, and then we will go to Arjun. I don't know if you can share your slides. If not, we will help you.
Thank you so much, Kim. So I cannot share my slides on my end. So I don't know if Pedro could please throw up the slides for me. I would be very grateful. I just emailed them to him a couple of minutes ago, just to be sure. But I can begin anyway while we get ready with the PowerPoint. And that is to say, firstly, I'm delighted to be here. My Spanish is absolute nonsense. I will not pretend to pronounce anything in Spanish, except probably at the end. But I did start to look at some terms in Spanish as I started to look at what the questions were. And the minister in Sierra Leone, the Minister of Finance and Planning specifically, talks about inequality right now as being a pandemic within a pandemic. And for the Spanish speakers, una pandemia dentro de una pandemia. I will not try any more Spanish after this. It is a promise. But one of the things I started to look at was how do we conceptualize this whole problem of inequality? And from where I come from, because I'm one of the only specialists in the field, there is a lovely African proverb that says, if you wish to move mountains tomorrow, you must start by lifting stones today. And I think inequality is one of those things. If we don't keep digging at it and building our resilience around it, it is like a slippery slope. So that is my second slide. Unfortunately, I cannot see the slides on my end. I will continue.
Pedro, can you
without
we have a little problem, but it will be ready in a few seconds.
Gracias a todos. Okay, so when I look at issues around what I've been working on, inequalities, so I've been working in inequalities now for about 15 years, but from the perspective of fiscal law and policy. And I work in the area of fiscal legitimacy specifically, and there are 7 principles I believe are core to fiscal legitimacy: accountability, transparency and responsibility, efficiency and effectiveness, all of which have serious inequalities no matter which way you look at it. But the 2 elements that I've added on, which I borrow from a North African economist called Ibn Khaldun, is fairness and justice. And the reason I use that is because I think it is a critical part of getting us to a position of equality, of leveling the playing field. I mean, this is terminology we hear very commonly now. But the vaccines have really brought to the forefront the problems of inequality. a government exported vaccines did not leave them for their own country people. This is the case of India that is on the debate right now. So where's the responsibility issue? Where's the efficiency issue? I mean, there's so many things to think about in it. But then on the other hand, lack of selfishness is part of that whole conversation as well. So can we really criticize as much as some people have been doing? So I began by looking at it from that philosophical standpoint, but then I go further into it because not only do I work on issues around inequalities at the global level, and I have a recent paper that's just been published at the Emory Law Review, and that is a paper on discrimination in the international tax system. And what we do is, myself and my co-author Stephen Dean, we looked at 10 spots where tax havens were creating inequalities in the global tax system. And these inequalities are not just about financial inequalities, they're about gender equalities. It is very difficult to find women moving in these international spaces. And when they do move there, they are very often not taken seriously. When I move into regional inequalities, then the regional inequality work that we do talks about a lot of the African Union's work, the countries trying to work together regionally, work around the African Tax Administrators Forum. And in these regional inequalities, we have a different type of fiscal challenge, which is we have middle income countries with big economies. And then you have these least developed countries.
Excuse me,
Yes.
yeah. I need to be the presenter.
Okay. What do I need?
Could you make me presenter to share the presentation? Yeah. Sorry,
Oh, there it is. It's up. I can see it.
Now.
Can you see it?
Yes. Here it is.
All right. Thank you, Pedro.
Welcome.
If you could move to the 4th slide, please, that would be great. Thank you.
This one.
Yes, perfect. So then comes regional inequalities. And so what we start to see is least developing countries have a serious problem when it comes to inequality, because a lot of the international fiscal rules being set up are there to really help more middle income countries. There are about 8 or 9 that can even aspire to be middle income on the African continent. So that leaves about over 35 to 45 of them really struggling in issues of inequality when it comes to tax systems. And then within national inequality, I look a lot at the issues around the fact that we have counties, or we have slightly federal system within my country, but we have inequalities across them, and they have policies around it on how to share revenue, for example, but these are never good enough. It's always the phrase I like to use, it's always a suboptimal compromise. And so there are all of these layers, all the steps of the way. And if we don't take cognizance of them, then we will have problems. So that's the area of research I work on. But I noticed a question on COVID. And I recently finished a paper arguing for solidarity taxes and funds and trying to set out whether or not solidarity-based taxes and funds could be a way forward. And I saw a question on Colombia. And in Colombia, it was very interesting because the solidarity tax was only imposed initially on the public sector. So it was public service employees paying it, but not the whole country. Now, this in itself is an additional layer of inequality in the system. And it got a lot of criticism and was in the end declared unconstitutional by the courts in Colombia. So a lot of inequalities are not just about African inequalities. It's inequalities at a global level all the time. And even in a crisis, we are actually perpetuating inequalities as we try to resolve problems. And this is something I like to work in. Next slide, please. So what are the roles and priorities that I think universities or the academy should emphasize to contribute to the fight against inequalities? Next slide, please. So one part of my life is the work I do on fiscal systems. The other part of my life for the past year and a half now is that I'm the director for research for the University of Nairobi. And we have really struggled in making sure that we reduce inequalities, but we've also been trying to build our researchers and our capacity. And so there are so many inequalities. There's the ones between the global north and the south. For example, with the vaccines, we had a fantastic researcher who was developing a vaccine at the University of Nairobi, but unfortunately could not get funding because vaccine trials are only funded by domestic states of their domestic researchers. And then this is a particular area of knowledge which we find policymakers are actually unaware of, that there's this element of nationalism when it comes to funding certain types of certain types of research. So I sort of see two areas. There's the internal inequalities and the external ones, the ones within our universities and within our institutions. And one like mine that has 1,500 academic staff, internal inequalities are huge because of the size of public universities in developing countries like mine. But then there's the external ones, which I've already started to talk about. But I've noticed that there is a constant lack of respect and recognition for the quality that universities produce in developing countries. There is a presumption always. I see it between Anglophone and Francophone. I don't know about Lusophone, but I'd be happy to hear what Spanish speakers say. But there is this constant preference for Anglophone of the African continent. When it comes to Anglophone versus Francophone on the continent, there's preference for the Anglophones over the Francophones. And these cause and continue to cause an undermining of researchers who are otherwise brilliant, working on issues around inequality, themselves face so many of these challenges. But I also think we have very poor marketing. Next slide, please. And in that poor marketing, it actually results in a lack of awareness that domestic specialists are often better. So very often you hear about international consulting companies being brought in to develop economic policies for our countries. And it's a constant surprise because when there are committees being set up in governments, they come to the university. When there is a funded piece of work or consultancy, it goes off to an international organization, and very often not necessarily a university, but a consulting firm of some kind. Within our universities, we are starting to have different types of inequalities. So I've mentioned some of them a little bit, and I won't repeat them, but there's issues of age, race, ethnicity. These issues of inequality then result in either preference for one or the other, but the inequality on data is probably one that really destroys our ability to move forward. Funding systems tend to be designed in a manner that they do not consider existing inequalities. Next slide, please, Pedro. And so when I started to look at that, how can we be more influential? Next slide, please. So I think that the role of universities, researchers, so big name researchers need to be more inclusive. Next slide, please, Pedro. Thank you. So we need to improve the perception of universities, but it cannot be done from the outside. It has to be done from within. And we're trying to sensitize on the importance of local scholars of, one slide back, please, Pedro, but also the importance of data within universities. So that's really important. Thank you, Pedro. Yes, that's where it is. People don't realize that it is important to also fund researchers from low-income households. And I was very happy the introduction. Carlos mentioned, ethical principles and the Jesuits. Well, I'm not sure that there are any allocations of funding for researchers who come from low-income households. I currently mentor a group of about 20 undergraduate researchers, and one of the things I've noticed is when I don't have grant funding to keep them going, I tend to then get middle or upper class researchers staying with me because they can afford to. But the lower income, the students or the researchers who come from lower income households are not actually able to stay on board because grants tend to be cyclical, funding tends to be irregular. And so this is something I think is really worth looking into. Next slide, please. And so that is about supporting universities, but what about supporting the role of researchers? So I think we do need to continue to deepen research on inequality and, of course, in my field, fiscal inequalities, absolutely. But I also think that inequality is not just about the researcher, it's about how they work in the spaces they work in. So inclusivity and balance in employment, making sure that domestic researchers also take lead or partner up at equal footing with PIs or principal investigators from other countries, I think is really important. But I also think the issue of balancing off the inequality gaps and mentoring in academia, mentoring north-south, mentoring within institutions and between researchers within the same field. But I wonder sometimes if quotas and affirmative action would also not be interesting. The last is it's a difficult relationship, academia working with government and the private sector. I find that in developing countries, the respect for the intellectual is not there, but the respect for the money is much more valued, with the result that that imbalance, even in negotiations, results in often a skewed output, even on the research front. Next slide, please, Pedro. And so in conclusion, I think the inequality crisis is alarming, and it's on the rise. And I think it's a problem globally. I think it's not just an African problem. And I think everybody must play their part. Universities need to take many measures to reduce inequalities, and steps need to be now taken. But I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation. Last slide, please, Pedro. And so I want to end with another African proverb, which is that I think knowledge is like a garden, and if it's not cultivated, it can't be harvested. We've got to work on it consistently and all the time. I'll stop there. I hope I kept within my time, and thank you very much for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Tia, for your very powerful points, and very important ones in terms of the need for global balance, not only for respect, but for shifting the power, the knowledge bases to the global south, and everything that is coming from there. And that was actually one of the underlying objectives of this seminar, having your voices from the global south here to also share what are you on, but also listen to your brilliant insights. So thanks, and we move to Arjun. Again, let's see how the slides thing go.
We have
Let
to
me see if
make
this
a
works.
presenter, to adjunct presenter. Danny, please.
Let me just try it. Just give me a second.
Right, if not, I'm ready.
Yeah. I think I have it. Oh, it just disappeared. Hang on. Let me try it again.
No?
Wait, hang on. Yeah, I think I've got it. Is this working?
Apparently,
Yes.
apparently it is, and it's coming. Yes, in this case,
Great. Okay,
we got
wonderful.
it. Finally. Thanks, Arjun.
Okay, great. I'm glad.
Floor is yours.
All right. Yes. So thanks to everyone for all the very insightful papers, and it's really a pleasure to be speaking with this very varied group. So I wanted to maybe bring some potentially good news to the whole debate, from my perspective in any case. I've been working on inequality in one way or the other now for the last 15, 20 years. And really, I do feel that over the last 10 years, there's been much more openness to inequality as a subject of academic and broader concern, even compared to, say, 10, 12, 15 years ago, right? And part of the reason, I think, is that we've had now much more real-world movements, such as Seattle in '99 with an Occupy. We've seen the rise of authoritarianism in many countries. At the same time, we've had many kind of academic works, a work of people like Branko Milanovic and Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz. And these two, I think, have co-evolved to make inequality really a kind of a much more vibrant and important topic than it was, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, right? I think in economics, which is my home field, there's also been a lot of advance in overturning what used to be, in some sense, I think, a lazy assumption that if you had more equality, you would have more inefficiency. And there's a trade-off that's associated with that. That's a very famous old kind of thinking. And I think that we've seen over the last maybe 15, 20 years, different kinds of examples of ways in which people are trying to assess and substantiate the idea that actually having more equality can actually be more efficient as well, right? A very easy example might be early childhood education, making sure that early childhood education is available for everybody, universalization, and that actually enhances both equity and efficiency. Also, earlier explanations of what we saw as the rising inequality, things like what technically is known as skill bias technical change, the idea that people were more getting richer because they just had better skills. I think now it's become extremely clear that that's not a satisfying explanation for what we've seen. We've also seen across the world, I think, much more data available in the last 10, 15 years, much better work looking at tax data and so on to make sure that these kind of explanations, skill bias, technical change, and so on, really are not substantiated, if you will, empirically. So I think there's a definite openness in the academy to understanding distribution on its own terms now in the last maybe 5, 10 years, compared to what it was, 20 years ago when it was seen as a second order question, if at all. I'd also like to say that in teaching, as academics, I think we're facing what sometimes people have called a Samuelsonian moment. This is after in the 40s, Paul Samuelson, when he wrote his famous textbook, which has become, the textbook for many, many of us. It was a particular moment in history where a certain set of questions could be asked, and I think we're facing that. And just by way of some evidence, some people I work with, this project called Core Economics, asks this question across the world, right? What is the most pressing problem economists should be addressing? And this is a word cloud with 4,400 students in 25 universities around the world, and you'll see, excuse me, that inequality is actually one of the biggest topics, if not the biggest topic, that students say that we have to address. So I think in the academy, this urgency is actually quite intense, right? Now, Chema had given me the brief that I should speak a little bit about my work and my engagement in the field of inequality. I've taken that seriously, and I just thought I should just speak a little bit about these 3 or 4 areas in which I've seen, which I've done work, which I think actually now are bearing fruit in terms of understanding for policymakers and actually pushing through for policy. So I spent some time working with Sanjay Reddy at the New School, trying to understand and actually axiomatically and theoretically come up with better measurements for understanding inequality between people of different groups. We're used to thinking about inequality, the Gini coefficient or whatever it is, as a not considering groups as part of the base set of information, as it were. But we're not used to doing this with groups, and so this is some work that I've done with him. But we've also spent a lot of time trying to actually enhance and make more available some of the vast improvements in data that I mentioned, right? So we have with Rahul Lahoti a project called the Global Consumption Income Project, in which we have open source and availability of a lot of data of inequality measurement across every country in the world for about 30, 40 years. And the idea is to actually generate for activists, for journalists, and so on, an ability to actually understand what's been going on. So if you will, the what is happening with inequality. But my background has also been in some sense in classical political economy. And I spent many years really trying to excavate the extent to which the old classical concerns about the division between, say, capitalists and laborers and so on, whether it had any traction in our modern economy. And when I wrote these papers in the early to mid 2000s and the late, around 2010, it was considered an ancient topic, right? But really, I think across the world now, in the last not even 10 years, 5 years, there's been a spate of papers asking about this particular question, whether in fact the old way of looking at the world as being divided into, if you will, classes, can tell us a little bit about the processes of inequality. So you'll see on the right-hand side these pictures of the labor share of income globally. It's the amount of income that goes to labor as opposed to capital, and it's normalized. And you can see that since the 80s, there's been strong evidence that it's been declining. So most of the income in the economy, or an increasing part of the income in the economy, is going to capitalists rather than labor. So that's another set of areas in which I think actually now there's a much bigger kind of volume of interest than I would have imagined when I did this about 15 years ago. The third kind of area in which I feel like there's a lot to be talked about is the fact that, in fact, the global system is not set up in a way that is a level playing field. Athiya mentioned this with respect to things like access to data, but it's even more than that. I think, for example, with the World Trade Organization, much of what they accomplished in the 1995 round, when they established rules for intellectual property, was a way to actually make it impossible or much harder for developing countries to catch up, because knowledge is, in some sense, in our modern economy, the key input to growth, right? So to me, global intellectual property right regimes is a way of actually creating not just a level playing field, not a level playing field, but in fact an upward distribution of income. That it's a way in which you privatize a commons, which should be available, and in which, in fact, if you don't do that, it has very serious impacts on efficiency. So here are two recent op-eds. One, the Times, which I wrote, which is about I'm very proud of this because of the news today. That Biden has actually, the Biden administration has actually said we're willing to suspend intellectual property rights. This is something that some of us wrote about 4 or 5 months ago, saying that you want efficiency, you want global distribution to occur in a way that is both efficient and actually just. You need to change the kind of structure of intellectual property that we have done. And similarly, earlier, I'd written about a year ago, what the deep inefficiencies of IPR, along with people like Joe Stiglitz, on really the fact that if you wanted a world which is more just, you'd have to have a way of sharing some of the real, the benefits of knowledge across the world in a more effective way. This is a third set of places in which I actually think we've been quite successful in moving the needle as academics, right? And finally, I've spent a little bit of time doing what I might say is kind of interesting to me work, but I'm not sure it really has much of a relevance, unlike the others, for activists and for civil society. What I've been very interested in is, if you want to call it, the political economy of inequality. So I've been interested in what are the consequences of this. What does this inequality crisis actually do to us as a society? One of the areas that I've been working on extensively is this concept that this economist Sam Bowles and I call guard labor. And the idea here is that as we become more unequal, we spend more and more resources on guarding stuff rather than making stuff, right? And actually, this is a very nice scatter plot of the amount of people who are guards in a country and the inequality in that country. And this is in OECD countries, but this actually repeats itself in urban areas and so on. And you can see the more unequal the country is, the more it has to spend in its resources in things like security guards and so on, right? So this is another set of areas. And finally, I've spent a little time looking at, if you will, the physics of inequality. I spent some time looking at the power laws, what's happening at the top end of the distribution with respect to wealth. So these are just areas in which I think there's a lot of interest currently that's still there, and I think that it's actually very fertile for activists and for civil society to be looking at. And I would say that to end, that really there is now space for intervention in a way that there wasn't maybe 15 years ago, when inequality was much more naturalized. Now I think the consensus is that inequality is not natural. I mean, there may be some inequality. Up to a point there may be inequality, but beyond that, one should not think of it as natural, and rather that structures and policies really matter for the global distribution of income, right? Some things like intellectual property, I think, are systems which are stacked against justice and equality, and also, as it turns out, efficiency. So there's been a very interesting set of academics, all across the world, but particular people like Danny Roderick or Suresh Naidu and others, who are really trying to see how we might want to rewrite the rules of the global economy to enhance both justice and efficiency. And then finally, I would say that one of the great benefits, I think, of having an embedded research in inequality is that it becomes very useful for movements which are trying to redress these issues. So, for example, as I said, the global movement for access to medicines has become really quite powerful, has really had much more of a voice than it did, 20 years ago. If you think of what happened with the HIV crisis in Africa, and the fact that actually it took a lot to actually get medicines, we're seeing that sort of change right now. And I think the academy really thinking through these issues, supporting, helping, and allying with movements has been extremely central to this process. Okay, and with that, I'll end my first.
Thanks a lot, Arjun, for your insights to both what is your work now, but what should be the main focus of the academic and the university's research and influence on inequality, and why that it's extremely important. What is behind? Why it should be? What are the main drivers for that?